Okay, folks, let's talk carburetors now. So we just talked about the cycles of the engine. So we're going to put our engine right up here in the corner. All right. That's our engine. In fact, we'll actually, let's say we'll do one cylinder. Some spark plugs and a piston. Okay. So we got a cylinder up there. So the way a carbureted system works is we have what we call a float bowl where the fuel goes. So the fuel moves to the engine somehow. It's either gravity fed or it uses a pump. And we'll talk about that more in the fuel system. However the fuel gets delivered to the carburetor float, it gets delivered and it sits here for a little bit. And there's a float in the tank that closes a valve if the fuel level gets too high. So it regulates the amount of fuel in the bowl at once. At the base of the bowl is a tube. That leads towards what's called the venturi, the intake for the air and the fuel. So we got a venturi here that will draw. And fuel flows from the float through this tube and then into this delivery. That's not a real nice way to show it. Into this tube that then spits it out into the engine. Really what happens is we get a low pressure, a very low pressure in this zone of the venturi as air comes through and that sucks fuel. All right, so what's happening here is air flows into the venturi and it accelerates rapidly coming through. And as it accelerates, just like when air accelerates over the top of a wing, it creates a low pressure. And also, we're going to talk about this in a sec, it creates a low temperature. And it comes through, and then at that point, the fuel in here has been pulled through this line, and it goes out, and now we've just got a mixture of air mixed in with fuel, and that gets delivered to the engine. Now, a couple things. First of all, we have a mixture control in the bowl here that if it moves all the way down, it cuts off flow of fuel. But if we move it just like a little bit up, then it lets a little bit of fuel down here at the bottom get through. So that's how we change. We've talked about the mixture control already, but this is the mechanics of it. As we turn the mixture knob, that moves a cable, which moves this little rod, which can either totally cut off fuel flow by going into the tube here, or can totally open it by getting completely out of the way. That's how the mixture control works. So, like I said, via cable, that just goes to the mixture control that we're used to messing with in the airplane, that we just move back and forth or rotate depending on the airplane. So that's how mixture control works. Next, we got to talk about throttle control. At the end of the venturi, we have a plate. That plate can either be closed, like in this position, or it can be totally wide open, like in this position. If it's green like that, that's open throttle or full power. And if it's gray, it's closed, or that's not how you spell idle, or idle. And it's a similar principle as the mixture. We use a cable attached to the throttle plate to move the throttle control. And it's that simple. We just move it back and forth, and we either allow more air fuel to come through or less. Now, there's one other thing. We have a carburetor heat control that we haven't really talked about much yet, right? And same deal, we can move it. Usually you push it in, that's off. You should pull it out, that's on. That's usually how carburetor heat works. Sometimes it's a more of an up-down kind of lever as well. What that's doing is it's changing the angle of a plate in our air intake. So what this looks like at the bottom is we have air intake that can come from the outside. So it's fresh air, and it comes through, and as it comes through, it hits a metal plate in the intake box there, and it goes up. And it goes up and it mixes with fuel, and it goes past the throttle plate, it goes into the engine, and it burns. Sometimes when the outside air is either very cold or very moist, and moisture is the bigger issue, it cools off in the venturi. Like I said, that low pressure is associated with a low temperature. And when that happens, there is a possibility for it to start forming ice, and it can actually close off the air intake, which is obviously a problem. So to fix that, we can actually take this plate here and we can rotate it. And when we rotate it, we change the intake source for the carburetor venturi for the air source. And what we end up getting is we get warmer air that we've preheated by running it through a shroud that's from the exhaust. So if you remember the exhaust stroke of the engine, we have this hot air that's running through tubes before it gets spit out as exhaust. What we do is we take fresh air from an intake and we run it in a tube that passes through basically like a metal box called a shroud that surrounds there. That actually, it doesn't even surround. The hot air actually flows in the shroud, but the colder intake air is still separated in its tube. But as it passes through, it gets preheated. So all of a sudden, the air was cold, but now it's gone past the exhaust air, so now it's heated up. It doesn't have any exhaust in it. It shouldn't, but now it's heated up. Now we can let it come in and flow up into the engine. And now as it cools down through the low pressure, it won't actually get so cold that it creates ice. And then it goes back into the engine. Okay, that's the basics of a carbureted system. Try to get out into a maintenance shop at some point if you can. Ask your instructor and see if you can just get your hands on some of this stuff. It's kind of an easier way to sort of grasp it is if you can put your hands on it. Okay, at least that helps a lot of people. It helps me. So give it a shot and let us know if you have any questions.